Okay, folks, this is a brief video which will talk through that exercise from the first class where I asked you to think about some of the structuring techniques used in the opening few minutes. I think it was 11 minutes of School of Rock. So in that section, the viewer's given a lot of information. It's interesting to think about just how much information is given to the viewer in this relatively simple film, a mainstream work of popular cinema. It's nevertheless quite complex, and it's certainly very clever the way that it's put together. So we have a lot of information about the main character and the character's situation. We can see the situation developing. To use the scriptwriter's term, we can see it as the setup. And if you know the film, you know that following the initial setup, and this opening 10 minutes is perhaps the first 2/3 of the setup, there are then further complications, and there is ultimately a resolution. And this can be mapped more or less onto our general pattern of equilibrium, disequilibrium, and equilibrium. But I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm going to talk about the smaller structuring techniques that Warren Buckland introduces in his chapter on narrative. And you'll remember that those are the use of obstacles, of dialogue hooks, of dangling causes, of exposition, and of deadlines. So I've looked at some of the responses to this, and thanks to all those that participated in the feed on obstacles, some great stuff, and all of it right. What I'm going to do is concentrate on what I think are the main uses of those elements. There were many more, but these are the main uses as far as I'm concerned. And the first concerns the obstacle, which is the fact that Dewey has to find a way of paying rent. This obstacle is also linked to a deadline. The rent has to be paid to his friends who own the apartment by the end of the week, which adds urgency to the character's attempts to overcome the obstacle and engages our attention a little more. In relation to this obstacle, we're also given exposition when his friends discuss him in a slightly stagey way, but nonetheless it works for the setting up of the scene. They discuss him as being a useless freeloader, give him a backstory, I suppose, give more information to his character to build up the likelihood that this obstacle will not be overcome, because it hasn't been overcome in the past. And in the course of the exchange between Dewey, Ned and Patty, the cause is set up that will find its effect when Dewey takes up the teaching job. So we have a linking of cause and effect over the course of a small number of scenes in this section. There's also questions that aren't answered immediately, specifically to do with the relationship between Dewey and Ned, and between Ned and Patty, and these are left to dangle, to use Buckland's term, the dangling cause, and not given an effect until much later in the story. But they are dealt with by the end of the film. The loose ends are tied up. There are many examples of dialogue being used to stitch scenes together in the manner of a dialogue hook, but perhaps the strongest, well certainly my favourite, is when you see Dewey in his apartment talking on the phone to the head teacher about the teaching job, and this is followed by an abrupt cut to his arrival in his van outside the school. So we've moved in space and time. We've jumped forward in time, and we've moved from the interior of the apartment to the exterior outside the school. So this quite dramatic jump in space and time is not hidden, but it's facilitated by the dialogue hook. The hook in the preceding scene moves into the scene that follows, stitching the two scenes together, and in a way stitching our attention into the movement. Once in the school, Dewey's overcome his first obstacle, but of course that's not the end. It'd be a very short film if that was the end of the story, once that obstacle of getting a job to pay the rent had been overcome, and Dewey is in fact confronted with many other obstacles, the most obvious being the children in the class. These are the students who have to be taught, and Dewey doesn't know how to teach. They express doubt about his methods, and again this obstacle to be overcome is structured in relation to a deadline, that of the school day, with breaks and a home time when Dewey can be free of his burden. There's exposition concerning the school's regulations. The dangling cause is the authority of the teacher, the head teacher, and her scepticism about Dewey and whether or not she'll uncover that deception. Again, that has to be resolved later in the film. Running parallel with this main setup of obstacles, which is the kind of physical thing that we see, is the conflict between Dewey and his band and his ambitions with that band. The obstacle here is Dewey being kicked out of the band, and therefore he is unable to compete in the Battle of the Bands, and that narrative strand is entwined within the strand concerning Dewey's masquerading as a teacher. So those initially separate strands are intertwined and in fact become the solid substance of the story. Dewey organises the students into a group of musicians in accordance with the deadline of competing in the Battle of the Bands. At the same time, he's got to avoid the obstacles of being uncovered by other teachers, by the school authority, by parents, and by his friends Ned and Patty. So we can see that a simple film like School of Rock is very carefully constructed to engage and retain our attention, and that some of the structuring techniques we've discussed are important in that process of making the story a silly story about a silly character, but those techniques make that silly story matter to us. They make it real. So there's a lot, of course, that we haven't talked about in this opening section. In fact, we haven't talked about some of the most important things that make a film, such as the way that the camera follows Dewey and frames him to show that he's in a world of his own. We see him playing his guitar solo with complete disregard for what his band is doing. Perhaps his self-absorption is best exemplified by the framing and editing of his dive off stage. No one catches him. He's shown isolated. He's in a rock dream world, and that framed image rotates and turns into Dewey in his bed, the dreamer. So this presentation of the physicality of the performance and its framing and editing adds complexity to the character's situation, giving depth to the character as someone whose own personality may be the biggest obstacle that he's got to overcome. So in addition to identifying what's happening in terms of obstacles and deadlines, we need to think about how characters and events are shown, how they are presented on screen as framed shots that are cut together, and it's this that we look at in the next live class session. We'll be looking at the shot, the framing of the shot, and the editing of the shots. We'll be looking at how stories of characters overcoming obstacles are presented as moving images. So we'll be getting closer to a more fully developed understanding of how films work.